My name is Rachel Mercer. I was the daughter who chose the Marines when my brother chose gambling. The day I came home from Camp Lejeune, my father and my brother were standing on my porch laughing. "Now you're homeless," my brother said, leaning against the white railing I had painted myself 12 summers ago. I just smiled. "What's so funny?" my father snapped. His voice wasn't playful. It was tight, almost defensive. I set my duffel bag down at my feet and looked at the front door of the little brick ranch I had bought when I turned 42. The azaleas I planted were blooming purple along the walkway. The American flag I'd mounted beside the door was still there, though it hung crooked. "The house you sold," I said evenly, "actually is." I let the sentence hang. Their laughter faltered. But that's not where this story really starts. It starts 2 years earlier on a humid August morning in Jacksonville, North Carolina, when I signed my name to the final mortgage payment on that house. I remember sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the letter from the bank that said, "Paid in full." I had served 21 years in the Marines. I'd deployed twice. I had missed birthdays, funerals, and Thanksgivings. But I had paid for that house myself, dollar by dollar. I never married. I never had children. The Corps was my first commitment, and responsibility was my second. My brother Tommy had different priorities. Tommy was 3 years younger, handsome in a careless way, always the one people described as charming. He could walk into a VFW hall and walk out with 3 new friends and a free beer. But charm doesn't pay credit card bills, and it doesn't fix what happens when betting on football games turns into late-night poker rooms and cash advances. By the time I was stationed at Camp Lejeune for what I thought would be my final stretch before retirement, Tommy owed more money than he would ever admit out loud. My father, Harold Mercer, was a proud man, a retired electrician. He believed sons deserved second chances and daughters could take care of themselves. "Your brother just needs a little help getting back on his feet," he'd say, whenever I visited home. I had helped before. 5,000 here, 3,000 there. Once I paid off a loan shark Tommy had gotten tangled with, thinking fear would scare him straight. It didn't. 6 months before I came home for good, my father called me late one evening. I was in my base housing apartment ironing my service uniform for the next morning. "Rachel," he said, clearing his throat, "I've been thinking. You're not using that house while you're on base. Maybe I should hold on to the paperwork. Just in case." "In case of what?" I asked. "In case something happens, for protection." I hesitated. But he was my father. He had helped me fix the roof when a storm tore shingles loose. He had mowed the lawn when I was deployed. "I'll mail you copies," I said. "The originals stay in my safe." He didn't argue, at least not then. What I didn't know was that Tommy's debts had ballooned. Not small-town poker games anymore. He had gotten involved with online betting sites, credit cards stacked on top of each other, and a man in Wilmington who loaned money at interest rates that should have been illegal. When I got the orders confirming my transition out of active duty, I felt relief. I was coming home. I pictured repainting the guest bedroom, maybe finally adopting that older Labrador I kept seeing at the shelter. Instead, 3 weeks before my move, my calls to my father started sounding strange. "You might want to consider selling," he said casually one afternoon. "Market's good." "I'm not selling," I answered. "That house is my retirement." Silence. "Then we'll talk when you're back." The morning I drove into town, my heart was steady. I had a U-Haul trailer behind my truck and a folder in my passenger seat with every document connected to that property deed, tax receipts, insurance papers. I turned onto my street and saw a sedan I didn't recognize parked in the driveway. My porch. My brother's laugh. And a man in a polo shirt holding what looked like a clipboard. "Afternoon," the stranger said, offering a tight smile. "You must be Rachel. I'm the new owner." New owner. My brother grinned. "Dad handled the sale. Figured you wouldn't mind. Helped out the family. Now you're homeless." My father wouldn't meet my eyes. For a moment I felt something hot rise in my chest. Not fear, not even anger. Betrayal. 21 years in uniform, and the only place I ever called mine had been treated like a poker chip. But I didn't yell. Instead, I smiled. Because as I stood there, I noticed something small but important. The front door still had my deadbolt, my key, and the for sale sign I had driven past 2 blocks earlier. It wasn't a sign from any real estate company I recognized. No broker logo. No MLS number. "What's so funny?" Tommy demanded, irritation creeping into his voice. I looked at the man with the clipboard. "Did you close through First Coastal Title?" I asked him. He blinked. A private arrangement." "And the funds cleared through my mortgage lender?" I continued. "Well, your father said that the house was free and clear," I finished. It was, but not in the way they thought. I reached into my truck and pulled out a thin folder. "You see," I said quietly, looking at both of them, "now the house you sold actually is held under a recorded transfer on death deed." They stared at me blankly. "It means," I continued, my voice steady as a parade ground, "it cannot be legally transferred without my signature. And I never signed anything." The man with the clipboard went pale. My father's shoulders sagged. Tommy's grin disappeared. "And if someone forged it," I added softly, "that's a felony in North Carolina." The porch felt very quiet. For the first time since I arrived, I wasn't the one on unstable ground. The azaleas rustled in the breeze. The flag beside the door fluttered. Home. The debt nobody wanted to name. The porch went silent in a way I had only ever heard before a storm. The man with the clipboard lowered his arm slowly. "Your father assured me everything was in order," he said, glancing between us. He looked less like a confident buyer and more like a man who had just realized he'd stepped into a family war. Tommy scoffed, but there was a crack in it now. "You're bluffing, Rachel. Dad wouldn't do something illegal." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Dad?" I said, keeping my eyes on him. "Did you sign my name on anything?" My father's jaw tightened. He had always been a solid man, broad shoulders, steady hands, from years of wiring houses and climbing ladders. But that afternoon, he looked smaller somehow. "I was trying to fix a problem," he muttered. "What problem?" I asked, even though I already knew. Tommy shifted his weight. "You don't need to drag everything out here." "Oh, I think I do," I said quietly. The buyer cleared his throat. "Maybe I should—" "Yes," I said gently, "you should." He didn't argue. He backed down the walkway, got into his sedan, and drove off without another word. I noticed he didn't ask for his money back yet. He probably didn't know who he'd paid it to. That was the part none of them had thought through. When the car disappeared around the corner, the 3 of us stood alone on the porch I had scrubbed with a brush every spring. I picked up my duffel bag and unlocked the door with my key. It opened smoothly. I stepped inside. The living room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something else, stress. Papers were stacked on my coffee table. Not mine. Tommy's handwriting. Bank statements. Red notices. A certified letter from a collection agency. "You went through my mail," I called back toward the doorway. Dad followed me in. It was piling up. "It wasn't yours." Tommy came in last, slamming the door harder than necessary. "You've been gone, Rachel. Someone had to handle things." Handle what I turned to face him fully now. "You're gambling." He bristled. "It wasn't gambling. It was investments." I let that sit in the air for a moment. "Football bets aren't investments, Tommy." His face reddened. "You don't understand. I had a system." I almost laughed, but there wasn't anything funny about it. "How much?" I asked. Neither of them answered. "How much?" I repeated. Dad sank into my armchair, rubbing his forehead. 42,000. The number didn't shock me. What shocked me was the exhaustion in his voice. $42,000, I said slowly. "And your solution was to sell my house." It was free and clear. Dad snapped, suddenly defensive again. "You weren't living in it. You've always landed on your feet." "That's not the point." He looked up at me, eyes glassy but stubborn. "He's my son. And I'm your daughter." Silence. Tommy paced the living room like a caged animal. "You're acting like we stole something." "You tried to," I said evenly. Dad's voice softened. "Rachel, I thought once it was sold you'd understand. We'd find you a condo. Something smaller." "You don't get to decide my future." The truth was harder than anger. It was this: my father believed I was strong enough to absorb the loss. Tommy wasn't. That had been the pattern our whole lives. When Tommy wrecked his first car at 19, Dad co-signed the loan for another. When I enlisted at 18, Dad shook my hand and said, "Make us proud." When Tommy maxed out his first credit card, Dad refinanced his truck. When I deployed overseas, Dad told the neighbors, "She can handle herself." Strength in our family had always meant self-sufficiency. It also meant you were the one expected to sacrifice. I walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where I kept my spare keys and warranty papers. The drawer was empty. "Where are my documents?" I asked. Dad hesitated. Tommy answered instead, "Safe deposit box." "In whose name?" Another pause. "Dad's." That told me everything. I leaned against the counter and folded my arms. "Did you actually receive money from that man today?" Dad nodded faintly. 20,000 up front. "And the rest?" "After the paperwork processed." My stomach tightened. "Dad, if there's no legal transfer, that money is going to come back to haunt you." Tommy threw his hands up. "So what will give it back?" "With what I asked." He didn't respond. Dad's voice dropped to a whisper. "He owes people, Rachel. Not just credit cards. Real people." There it was, the part nobody wanted to name. "Loan sharks don't send polite reminder letters." "How deep?" I asked. Tommy stared at the floor. "They said if I didn't pay by the end of the month." He didn't finish. I felt anger again, but it wasn't wild. It was cold and precise. "You involved Dad in this because you needed collateral," I said. Tommy looked up sharply. "I didn't ask him to sell the house." "But you let him." Dad's hands trembled slightly. "I thought if I could just get you settled somewhere else, he'd have a clean slate." "You can't buy someone else's discipline," I said quietly. The house creaked in the late afternoon heat. I walked back into the living room and picked up one of the letters from the coffee table. A final notice. Interest compounding weekly. "Did you ever consider calling me?" I asked. Dad's voice cracked. "I didn't want you worrying while you were serving." That almost broke me. "I've faced mortar fire," I said gently. "I can handle a phone call." Tommy slumped onto the couch. For the first time, he didn't look charming. He looked tired. "They won't wait," he muttered. I studied him carefully. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had made small, reckless choices that snowballed into a mountain. But the mountain didn't belong on my shoulders. I straightened. "Here's what's going to happen," I said calmly. "No more lies. No more fake sales. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to the county register of deeds and pulling every filing connected to this address. Then I'm calling First Coastal Title and my lender." Tommy opened his mouth to protest. And I added, looking at my father, "We are returning that 20,000 before anyone decides to press charges." Dad swallowed hard. "This isn't about punishment," I continued. "It's about reality." Tommy met my eyes finally. "You're not going to help." "I am helping," I said, "but not by setting myself on fire." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the living room floor. For years, we had danced around the truth of Tommy's addiction. We had renamed it, softened it, excused it. Now it stood in the center of my house like an uninvited guest. And I wasn't leaving. Paper trails and porch smiles. The next morning, I was up before sunrise the way I'd been trained for decades. Some habits never leave you. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and looked at the house in the pale gray light. It felt different now. Not broken, just exposed. Like a secret had been dragged into the open and forced to breathe. Dad hadn't slept much. I heard him pacing down the hallway in the guest room. Tommy stayed on the couch, snoring lightly, as if chaos were something he could simply rest through. At 8 sharp, I walked into the Onslow County Register of Deeds office. The woman behind the counter wore reading glasses low on her nose and greeted me with the calm professionalism of someone who had seen every kind of family mess imaginable. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need certified copies of any filings related to 412 Briarwood Lane within the last 6 months," I said. She nodded and disappeared into the back. I stood there thinking about how many Americans my age never check their property records until something goes wrong. We trust family. We trust signatures. We assume love is enough to protect paperwork. It isn't. When she returned, she handed me a small stack of documents. There was a quitclaim deed recorded 3 weeks ago, she said. My pulse stayed steady. May I? She slid it toward me. I read it once, then twice. My name appeared in shaky script. The notary stamp looked legitimate at first glance. But the signature wasn't mine. The R was wrong. Too rounded. I've signed my name on military documents for over 20 years. My signature is sharp, deliberate, almost angular. This one was hesitant, and the notary acknowledgement listed a location 2 counties over one I hadn't been anywhere near. Is there a copy of the ID used? I asked. No, ma'am, not filed with us. Of course, I murmured. I paid for certified copies and stepped outside into the warm North Carolina air. Next stop, First Coastal Title. The receptionist was polite but cautious when I explained the situation. Within minutes, I was sitting across from a middle-aged attorney named Mark Hensley. He listened without interrupting while I laid out the facts. You're saying you never signed this quitclaim deed? He asked. I did not. And you never authorized your father or brother to sign on your behalf? No. He leaned back in his chair. The transfer was recorded, but no formal closing went through our office. No title insurance issued. No funds disbursed through escrow. In other words, I said this was a private handshake. He nodded, legally vulnerable. I slid the certified copy across his desk. Look at the notary location. He studied it carefully. That notary's commission expired last year. For the first time since yesterday, I allowed myself a small private exhale. Forgery. Not complicated, not clever, just desperate. What are my options? I asked. We file a petition to invalidate the deed based on fraud. Given the circumstances, it should be straightforward. However, he paused. However, if money exchanged hands privately, that becomes a separate civil matter. I thought of the $20,000 sitting wherever Dad had put it. Understood. When I walked out of that office, I felt something I hadn't felt in 24 hours. Control. Back at the house, Tommy was in the driveway smoking. He looked up as I parked. Well, he asked. Well, I replied evenly, the deed is fraudulent. He stiffened. And the notary commission expired, I added. He dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his shoe. Dad handled that part. I walked past him toward the porch. You both handled it. Inside, Dad sat at the dining table with his hands folded. I spoke with a title attorney, I said calmly. The deed is invalid. We'll be filing to nullify it. He closed his eyes briefly. You forged my name, Dad. His voice trembled. I signed it. I thought if it looked official, it would solve Tommy's problem. He nodded faintly. Do you realize that's a felony? He looked up at me, shame written plainly across his face. I never meant to hurt you. I know, I said quietly, but you did. Tommy stormed in from the porch. This is ridiculous. We were trying to fix something. You were trying to hide something I corrected. He pointed at me. You always think you're better than us because you wore a uniform. This isn't about pride, I said steadily. It's about ownership. I placed the certified documents on the table. The house remains legally mine. That's not opinion. That's record. Dad stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. What about the buyer? He whispered. You'll return his money, immediately. Tommy scoffed. With what? With the $20,000 he gave you. Dad's face drained of color. You didn't spend it, I said sharply. Silence. Dad. His shoulders sagged. $10,000, he admitted. My stomach dropped. On what? He couldn't meet my eyes. Tommy answered instead. Interest payment. To buy time. There it was again. Time. Addiction always buys time. It never buys freedom. I sank into a chair. You sold my house on paper, I said slowly, to pay $10,000 in interest. Tommy's jaw tightened. It was going to turn around. No, I replied. It was going to get worse. Dad's voice cracked. I thought once you got back, we'd fix it together. I looked at him for a long moment. You don't fix a leak by burning down the house. The room went quiet. Outside, a neighbor walked his dog past the window. Ordinary life continued, as if our family hadn't just detonated itself. I gathered the documents neatly. We are undoing this legally, I said. No threats, no yelling, just facts. Tommy folded his arms. And what about the rest of what I owe? That I said meeting his eyes is your responsibility. He stared back at me, anger fading into something closer to fear. For years, Dad had smoothed the edges of Tommy's consequences. Covered bills, made calls, signed papers. Now the smoothing was over. And for the first time I could see it dawning on both of them, the house had not been theirs to gamble. It had always been mine. The real owner of the truth. That evening the house felt different. Not because the walls had changed, but because the illusion had. Dad sat quietly in the recliner, staring at the muted television without watching it. Tommy paced the kitchen, opening cabinets like answers might be hidden behind canned beans and cereal boxes. I stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard I had fenced myself. The oak tree in the corner still leaned slightly east, just like it always had. Solid, rooted, unmoved by temporary storms. I spoke with the attorney again, I said, without turning around. We'll file the petition to invalidate the deed tomorrow morning. Dad nodded slowly. Will they press charges? That depends on how cooperative everyone is. Tommy stopped pacing. You'd really do that. Send your own father to court. I don't want to, I replied calmly, but I also won't pretend it didn't happen. He stared at me like I was the unreasonable one. You don't understand what kind of people I'm dealing with, he said quietly. I turned around then. No, I understand exactly. I had served long enough to recognize fear when I saw it. Who are they? I asked. He hesitated. Just guys, he muttered. Private lenders. Names. He shook his head. Dad finally spoke. One of them came by last week. My stomach tightened. Here. He nodded. Did he threaten you? Dad swallowed. Not directly. Just implied things. That's when the final piece slid into place. This wasn't just about money. It was about desperation. About a father who thought he could outmaneuver danger by sacrificing something that wasn't his. You tried to protect him, I said softly. Dad looked at me, eyes wet. He's my boy. And I'm your daughter. The words weren't sharp this time. Just tired. Tommy leaned against the counter. You've always had control. A paycheck. A plan. I don't. That doesn't mean you take mine. He didn't argue. I walked into the hallway and opened the small linen closet near the guest room. From the top shelf behind a stack of towels, I pulled down a thin metal lockbox. Dad frowned. What's that? Something I set up 5 years ago. I carried it back into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. The metal scraped softly against the wood. When Tommy first asked me to co-sign that boat loan, I said I realized something. Tommy looked away. I realized that if I didn't protect my assets one day, I might not have them. Dad watched me carefully now. I opened the box and removed a folder thicker than the one I'd carried in from my truck. Inside were copies of a revocable living trust I had established after retiring from active duty. I transferred the property into a trust, I explained calmly. The deed you forged wasn't even technically attached to me as an individual owner anymore. Tommy blinked. What? The house is held by the Mercer Living Trust. I'm the trustee, and there's a secondary trustee listed. Dad leaned forward. Who? An attorney in Wilmington. Silence fell over the room. That means I continued any sale would require trustee authorization, which you don't have. Tommy ran a hand through his hair. So the whole thing was invalid from the beginning. Dad stared at the papers like they were written in another language. You didn't tell us, he whispered. I didn't need to. The truth was simple. I loved my family. But I had learned something during my years in uniform. Hope is not a financial strategy. I never wanted to use it against you, I said quietly. It was protection, not punishment. Tommy sank into the couch. You planned for this. I planned for unpredictability. Dad's voice trembled. So we were never going to lose the house. Not legally, I replied. The weight of that settled heavily. Tommy's anger cracked first. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said firmly. It makes me prepared. He stared at the ceiling. I thought if we sold it fast, he muttered, we could clear the interest, and then I'd win it back. Dad closed his eyes. That's the lie addiction tells, I said gently. Just one more bet. Just one more loan. Just one more deal. Tommy didn't respond. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I'm not calling the police, I said, after a long pause. But the deed will be voided. The buyer will be refunded what remains. And the rest. He looked at me warily. You will face. Dad's shoulders slumped. He can't pay it. Then he needs to confront it, I answered. Tommy stood slowly. You're not going to help. I met his eyes. I will help you find treatment. I will help you meet with a financial counselor. I will drive you to every appointment if I have to. He swallowed. But I will not gamble my home to pay your debt. The firmness in my voice didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. Dad reached for the trust documents with shaking hands. You really thought we might do something like this? I looked at him for a long moment. I thought fear might make you forget boundaries. He flinched slightly. Outside the porch, light flickered on automatically as dusk settled in. The same porch where they had laughed 24 hours earlier. What's so funny? Tommy had snapped. Now there was nothing funny left. Only truth. Dad's voice broke the silence. I'm sorry, Rachel. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Tommy didn't say it yet, but the bravado had drained from him. For the first time since I arrived home, I felt something shift. Not victory, not revenge. Balance. The house wasn't just brick and wood. It was the line. And the line, what's so funny? The next afternoon, I asked them both to sit on the porch. The same porch. I chose that spot on purpose. The air was thick with Carolina humidity cicadas buzzing in the trees. The azaleas were still blooming like nothing had happened. It struck me how ordinary everything looked. Betrayal doesn't change the landscaping. Dad lowered himself into the old wooden chair. Tommy leaned against the railing, arms crossed, but eyes tired. I've scheduled a meeting tomorrow morning, I said calmly. With the title attorney, and with the man who thought he bought this house. Tommy's jaw tightened. You didn't have to call him. Yes, I did. Dad rubbed his hands together. Rachel, can we just settle this privately? We are settling it privately, I said evenly, but properly. The truth was, I had no desire to humiliate them. I wasn't interested in revenge the way television makes it look loud, explosive, theatrical. My kind of revenge was simpler. Truth in daylight. The buyer, Mr. Dalton, arrived the next morning looking uneasy. He was in his early 60s, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with a small embroidered logo. A cautious man. Probably thought he'd found a good off-market deal. We sat around my dining table. The same table where I had once spread out blueprints for a kitchen remodel. Mark Hensley. The attorney placed a folder in front of Mr. Dalton. Mr. Dalton, he began calmly. The quitclaim deed filed 3 weeks ago is invalid. The signature was forged. The notary commission was expired. And the property is held in trust. Dalton looked at Dad, then Tommy. You told me everything was clear. Dad's face reddened. I believed it was. Tommy stayed silent. The funds you provided, Mark continued, were not processed through escrow and are therefore unsecured. My client is prepared to return the remaining $10,000 immediately. The additional $10,000. Dalton's head snapped up. Additional. Dad closed his eyes. The remaining funds were used, I said quietly, without my knowledge. Dalton let out a slow breath. I want my money back. You will receive what remains today, I replied. The rest is between you and the individuals you paid. Tommy shifted in his chair. You're throwing us under the bus. I turned to him slowly. No, I'm refusing to lie for you. Dalton stood up abruptly. I'll expect repayment of the full amount. You'll need to pursue that through proper channels, Mark said evenly. Dalton gathered his papers and left without shaking hands. The door clicked shut behind him. The house felt smaller somehow. Tommy stood first. You just made this worse. No, I said, keeping my voice steady. You did. He ran a hand through his hair. They're not going to wait for court paperwork. Dad looked between us, fear etched into his face. What if they come back here? They won't, I said firmly. How do you know? Tommy demanded. Because I had already made another call. That morning before the meeting, I'd stopped by the sheriff's department. Not to file charges. Not yet. But to document. To establish a record. I had explained calmly that there might be individuals attempting to pressure my family regarding private debt disputes. I had provided names, vehicle descriptions, and dates. Paper trails protect more than property. They protect people. If anyone sets foot on this property, I said, now they'll be dealing with law enforcement. Tommy stared at me, stunned. You'd bring cops into this. I already have, I replied quietly. Dad inhaled sharply. This is my home, I continued, and I will not let fear dictate what happens here. Tommy's bravado dissolved into something raw. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. It always goes this far, I said softly. It just starts small. $100 bet. A missed payment. A promise to fix it next week. Dad's voice cracked. We were wrong. I looked at him. Yes, I said gently. You were? There was no triumph in my chest. No surge of victory. Just a steady sense of rightness. Tommy sank into the dining chair again. So what now? Now, I said, you face it. He stared at the floor. I've already called a financial counselor in Wilmington, I continued. And there's a gambling addiction program through the VA hospital network. They work with family members, too. Tommy looked up sharply. You set that up? Yes. Dad blinked. Even after... Yes. Because revenge to me wasn't about destruction. It was about boundaries. I'm not losing my house, I said calmly. But I'm also not losing my brother if he's willing to fight for himself. Tommy's eyes filled slightly, though he tried to hide it. And if I'm not, he asked quietly. Then you'll live with the consequences, I answered. The porch outside creaked as a breeze pushed against the screen door. 24 hours ago, they had stood there laughing. Now you're homeless. I thought about that moment. What's so funny? The truth. The truth was funny because they had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken preparation for pride. They had mistaken love for permission. I stood up from the table. This house, I said evenly, was never yours to gamble. Dad nodded slowly. Tommy didn't argue. For the first time since I came home, there was no shouting, no defensiveness, no false bravado. Only reality. And reality, though painful, is cleaner than lies. The cost of enabling. The house felt quieter in the days that followed. Not peaceful, just stripped down. Dad moved slower. Tommy barely left the couch unless I told him we had somewhere to be. The first appointment with the financial counselor was on a Tuesday morning. I drove. No one spoke much on the way to Wilmington. The counselor, a woman in her late 50s with steady eyes and a calm voice, didn't ask dramatic questions. She asked practical ones. How much do you owe? Tommy hesitated. I didn't look at him. This wasn't my confession to make. 68,000, he finally said. Dad inhaled sharply. You said 42. That was months ago. The room felt tight. The counselor nodded, writing something down. Break it down. Credit cards, online betting platforms, personal loans, and 2 private lenders who charged interest weekly. When the total was written on the yellow legal pad, even Tommy looked stunned by the number. This doesn't get solved by one big payment, the counselor said calmly. It gets solved by behavior change. She outlined repayment structures, consolidation possibilities, legal advice if harassment escalated, and most importantly, treatment. Addiction thrives in secrecy. It shrinks in structure. On the drive home, Tommy stared out the window. I didn't think it was that high, he muttered. That's part of the problem, I said quietly. Dad sat in the back seat silent. That evening, I asked Dad to sit with me on the porch. The same porch. "I need to ask you something," I said gently. He folded his hands in his lap. "Why didn't you call me when it started getting bad?" He swallowed. "Because I thought I could fix it. At my expense." He flinched. "I never meant for you to lose anything. But you were willing for me to," I replied softly. The truth hung between us. Dad had always believed he was protecting Tommy, shielding him, buying him time. But what he had really been buying was delay. And delay feeds addiction. "You know what enabling is?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "It's when love removes consequences." He stared at the yard, eyes wet. "I thought I was helping him stand up," he whispered. "You were holding him up," I said gently. "There's a difference." Inside the house, Tommy was on the phone scheduling his intake appointment for the addiction program. I could hear his voice through the open window, quieter than usual. Dad wiped his eyes. "I failed both of you." "No," I said firmly. "You made a mistake." He looked at me, searching my face for anger. "I don't hate you," I continued. "But things are changing." He nodded slowly. "No more shared bank accounts," I said. "No more access to my documents. No more handling my mail. And you don't speak for me financially. Ever." "I understand. And if someone comes to this house asking for Tommy..." Dad looked uneasy. "We don't lie," I continued. "We don't hide. We document. And we call the sheriff if necessary." He nodded again. "Boundaries are uncomfortable when you've lived without them." The next week was difficult. Tommy's first group meeting left him quiet and shaken. He didn't like calling himself an addict. He didn't like admitting loss. But he went back. One afternoon, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I keep thinking I can still fix it myself," he admitted. "That's the addiction talking." He looked down. "I hate that you had to protect yourself from me." "I hate that I had to too," I replied honestly. He met my eyes then. "Why didn't you tell us about the trust?" "Because it wasn't about you," I said. "It was about responsibility." He nodded slowly. Dad began helping around the house without being asked. Fixing the porch step. Replacing a broken fence board. Small, quiet acts of restitution. One evening, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. $10,000, he said. "I sold my fishing boat." My throat tightened. "You didn't have to..." "Yes," he said firmly, "I did." It wasn't enough to cover the full damage, but it was acknowledgement. The rest would be negotiated legally with Dalton. Structured repayment, written agreements. Tommy found part-time work at a hardware store. Nothing glamorous. Honest work. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow. One night as we sat in the living room, Tommy looked at me. "I thought you'd call the police," he said quietly. "I considered it," I answered honestly. Dad stiffened. "But punishment doesn't teach discipline," I continued. "Structure does." Tommy nodded slowly. "You scared me," he admitted. "Good," I said gently. "You needed to be." The house began to feel like mine again, not because they left, but because the roles shifted. I wasn't the silent safety net anymore. I was the line. And they had finally seen it. Home isn't just a house. 3 months later, the azaleas had finished blooming. Summer had settled heavy and bright over Briarwood Lane. The porch boards had been sanded and resealed. The loose railing Tommy once leaned against while laughing had been reinforced by him. Life didn't snap back into place. It realigned slowly. The petition to invalidate the forged deed went through without complication. The judge barely needed 10 minutes once the expired notary commission and signature discrepancy were presented. The fraudulent filing was voided. Clean. Official. The paper trail had done its job. Mr. Dalton eventually accepted a structured repayment agreement through mediation. Dad's $10,000 from selling the fishing boat went directly toward it. The rest would be paid in installments by Tommy, documented, signed, and enforceable. For the first time in years, everything was in writing. Tommy kept attending meetings. He didn't glow with transformation. He didn't suddenly become wise or humble overnight. But he showed up. That mattered. One evening, he sat beside me on the porch steps. I didn't think I'd ever hit bottom, he said quietly. You did, I replied. He nodded. When you smiled? I glanced at him. That day he continued when I said you were homeless. And you just smiled. I thought you'd finally lost it. I let out a small breath. I smiled because I knew the truth. He swallowed. I've been running from truth a long time. The cicadas hummed in the trees. A neighbor watered her lawn across the street. Ordinary life, steady as ever. I can't promise I won't mess up again, he said. I'm not asking for promises, I replied. I'm asking for accountability. He nodded. Inside the house, Dad was at the kitchen table balancing his checkbook, something he hadn't done carefully in years. The trust document sat in a locked drawer now. Not hidden, not secret, just protected. Protection doesn't mean distrust. It means wisdom. Dad joined us on the porch a few minutes later, lowering himself slowly into the chair. I was wrong, he said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. I thought being a good father meant shielding him, he continued. I forgot that shielding can weaken a person. Tommy stared at his hands. And I forgot, Dad added, looking at me, that strength doesn't mean you owe us sacrifice. I felt something loosen in my chest. For most of my life I had been the reliable one, the stable one, the one who could handle it. But strength without boundaries becomes permission. And permission can destroy what you work to build. I don't regret serving, I said softly. And I don't regret protecting this house. Dad nodded. You shouldn't. The porch creaked gently beneath us. Home, not because it was saved, but because it was respected. That's the difference. Over the next few weeks, something else shifted. Tommy started taking responsibility publicly. He told extended family the truth before rumors could twist it. He didn't paint himself as a victim. He didn't blame Dad. He didn't blame me. That honesty did more than any argument ever could. One Sunday afternoon, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a money order. First repayment installment, he said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was his. Dad began volunteering twice a week at the church food pantry. Not to prove anything, just to move forward. Healing doesn't erase damage. It builds around it. Sometimes I sit in the living room at night, lights dimmed, and think about how close it came. If I hadn't set up the trust, if I hadn't checked the notary, if I had reacted with rage instead of resolve, the house could have been gone, and so could the fragile thread of family left between us. I don't tell this story because I enjoy the confrontation. I tell it because many of us, especially those of us over 60, believe family loyalty means unlimited access. It doesn't. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. Protect your documents. Check your records. Understand power of attorney. Never sign something under pressure. And never confuse silence with peace. Peace requires structure. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Tommy looked at me and said something I hadn't expected. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not burning everything down. I smiled slightly. I didn't need to, I replied. The truth was enough. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to draw a line with someone you love, know this. You can forgive and still protect yourself. You can love and still say no. And sometimes the strongest revenge isn't destruction. It's dignity. If you found something meaningful here, I hope you'll reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe in stories about strength, truth, and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed with me for the next one. The porch is quiet now. The flag hangs straight. And this house, my house, stands where it always did. Rooted.